Hello, dear friends. Freedom is not granted, it is recognized. Opinion piece, political cynicism, daily fraud, theater of masks, no one obeys law, politics and corruption, institutional corruption, life, liberty and respect, horizon of reconciliation, no decree can nullify life, economy and exploitation, states and double standards. True law is born in consciousness. Let's start. Political cynicism is the practice of acting with impotence, hypocrisy and deceit in the political arena, undermining public trust and participation. This is reflected in distrust and insincerity in politics, including the manipulation of reality to maintain power and control public opinion. Internationally, politicians use different yardsticks to measure human rights violations depending on the affiliation of the violating regime. We live in a cynical and hypocritical world where almost no one obeys all human laws, much less divine ones. There are states that claim to fight drugs, but they secretly traffic them for the benefit of a few and the harm of many. Nor are the laws of war or the Geneva Conventions complied with when civilians, ambulances, hospitals and schools are bombed. Some citizens engage in roguery in their businesses, but there are also others who do so because they consider a law unjust. This problem would end if natural law and customary law were applied. Although treaties such as the Geneva Conventions exist to protect civilians in times of war, we continually see attacks against hospitals, schools, ambulances, and basic civilian infrastructure. These acts contradict the universal principle of respect for human life, a pillar of natural law. Strategic logic overrides human dignity. The global economic system allows a handful of corporations to concentrate disproportionate wealth, while millions lack the basic necessities. Financial speculation, drug trafficking, and money laundering maintain mechanisms of power that are justified by artificial laws, but which violate natural justice. Natural law demands that wealth be acquired without harming others and guaranteeing the right of every human being to subsistence. Governments that claim to defend freedom repress internal dissent, violating human rights. States that fight drug trafficking in their rhetoric maintain covert links with these businesses. This reveals structural hypocrisy. The law is obeyed only to the extent that it favors those in power. At the social level, many citizens reproduce this dynamic. There is crookedness in business dealings or cheating in contracts. Acts that, although considered immoral or illegal, are seen by some as a response to rules perceived as unfair or unequal. In other words, everyday fraud can be a reflection of institutional corruption. If the elite don't follow the rules, why should the people? Contradiction. We live in a world where the contradiction between what is preached and what is actually done is visible almost every level. The simulation of morality, legality or justice coexists with practices that contradict those same norms. This tension generates a cynical and hypocritical environment. Institutions fail. States betray their own discourse, and citizens are forced to deal with laws that often seem designed more to control than to protect. Many governments declare policies to combat corruption, drug trafficking, or terrorism, while simultaneously supporting clandestine structures that operate in these same spheres with economic or geopolitical fins. Institutional hypocrisy becomes evident when drug laws are enacted while financial elites profit from the illicit market. International treaties such as the Geneva Conventions are signed but are violated with bombings of civilian areas, hospitals and schools, justifying these atrocities in the name of national security. In this framework, the law becomes a selective instrument applied only against the weak, while the powerful enjoy impunity. Principles. This reminds us of simple and universal principles. Every life is worthy and must be respected. Every freedom is sacred as long as it doesn't harm others. Every community has the right to maintain its way of life in justice and balance. All wealth comes from the common good and cannot be concentrated to dispose the many. Along with it, customary law restores sovereignty to us. It is the people who, over generations, shape the norms that govern them, no bureaucrats who legislate from distant palaces. True law is born in conscience. No decree can annul life. Freedom is not granted, it is recognized. In a world governed by these principles, there would be no wars of conquest, because no community would have the right to take the life or land of another. There would be no hunger on an abundant planet, because natural justice would prohibit the accumulation of wealth at the expense of misery. There would be no abstract laws that protect corporate interests while punishing human need. Politics would cease to be a theater of masks and would become a matter of mutual service. Natural law. Faced with this disorder, there are those who argue that the solution lies not in multiplying regulations or toughening punitive codes, but in returning to the basic principle of a natural law. This is understood as a set of universal principles that emanate from morality, reason, and the very order of nature. Respect for the life and dignity of others, recognition of freedom and the right to legitimate property, personal responsibility for actions beyond external coercion. Customary law, for its part, complements this foundation because it arises from custom community agreement, a long-standing practice. It is closer to the social conscience than bureaucratic decrees, and therefore more legitimate in the eyes of those who live by it. If humanity were to implement natural law and customary law as fundamental norms, states would not be able to hide their contradictions behind empty rhetoric, because they would have to respond to principles that depend not on political power, but on the natural order. Wars would prevent the deliberate attack on innocent people, because respect for life would become the guiding principle beyond strategic interests. Citizens would not be forced to choose between blind obedience to unjust rules and cheating to survive, because the laws would reflect a real and shared ethical agreement. In other words, a consistent application of natural law would eliminate the hypocritical dualism that characterizes the system today. We would all be subject to the same universal principle, from those in power to the social base. Philosophy. According to the famous linguist Noam Chomsky, political cynicism is an invisible poison that weakens democracies. In his view, the purpose of mass media is not so much to report on what is happening, but rather to shape public opinion according to the agendas of the dominant corporate power. For Saint Thomas Aquinas, natural law is part of the cosmic and divine order. Creation is governed by eternal law, and human beings participate in that eternal law through reason, which allows them to discern good and evil. Natural law does not depend on any political authority. It is universal, immutable, and accessible to every human being. Fundamental principles such as do good and avoid evil and respect for life are derived from it. A human law that contradicts natural law ceases to be true law and becomes a corruption of the law. From John Locke, in a state of nature, human beings are free and equal but subject to natural law, which teaches that no one should harm the life, liberty, or possessions of another if a government violates natural law and becomes tyrannical when the people have the right to resistance and rebellion. For Jean-Jacques Rousseau, human beings in a state of nature are free and guided by an innate goodness. It is an unequal society and the corruption of power that perpetuates it. The alternative would be to build a social contract based on the general will, where laws emanate from the community and respond to the common good. Cynicism was born in the 4th century before Christ, in classical Greece, with Antisthenes, a disciple of Socrates, and was consolidated by his most famous disciple, Diogenes of Sinope. Antisthenes, disillusioned with the politics and corruption of Athens, preached a life of virtue achieved through self-sufficiency and dismay from material goods and worldly pleasures. True happiness, according to Antisthenes, did not depend on external factors but on self-control and virtue. Imagine, if the universal principles of natural law, customary law, and the legitimate traditions of each people were the basis of social order, attacking civilians under any circumstances would be prohibited, forbidden, and conflicts would be resolved through ethical arbitration or community mediation, so violence would cease to be a means of foreign policy. In the economy, there would be no room for the speculation that destroys entire communities. Wealth would be linked to service and the common good, and resources would be shared fairly, since the excess hoarded by some at the expense of the misery of others would violate a natural principle. In politics, power would not be based on vertical structures and imposed, but rather through community agreements. In this way, a norm would only be valid if it is fair and accepted by those who live by it, not by external imposition. In social and cultural life, abstract laws that criminalize harmless behavior while leaving greater crimes unpunished would disappear. Each community could preserve its customs as long as they did not violate the universal principles of life, liberty, and respect. In short, natural law would be a universal compass. No one would be above it, neither a peasant nor a president. Customary law would provide flexibility and local roots, allowing each culture to organize itself according to its historical practices, as long as it does not contradict the basic principles of dignity and balance. Reset News. According to Paul Gold-Eagle, we are on the threshold of the Great Awakening and Exposition. Humanity is awakening and taking back its countries, while the reptilian leadership flees. According to Mr. Poole, several heads of state have been relocated to protective custody. Their public appearances are pre-recorded. Their power is ceremonial. Real decisions are now made within secure QFS nodes and in codes operating off-grid. Blackout protocols are operational. Satellite rotations have changed. Transmission towers in key countries were shut down between 2 and 4 a.m. The test patterns weren't glitches, they were markers. The arrest began long before the headlines. Now it's clear why some resignations occurred without explanation. They didn't resign, they were fired. Former FBI Director James Comey will be indicted within days according to reports. Gold and oil rise while stocks fall. Stocks slide continues while the dollar moderates its weakness. Copper price soars after world's second largest mine fails. Accounts are being reflected in the QFS. Legacy layers are being emptied and archived. Every transaction now leaves a quantum imprint. No more hiding. Financial systems are being synchronized with new frequency bands. Bonus redemptions for the upper echelons have been completed. Rigorous non-disclosure agreements silence the early beneficiaries, but leaks confirm the floodgates are about to open. The ABS detonation will bring 10 days of reversal of the information war. Instead of lies, the airwaves will overflow with truth. Mass awakenings will occur. Shock will paralyze many. Riots will erupt. The markets will be convulsed. However, QFS technology and medbeds will emerge from the ashes as the new pillars of civilization. The world not only watches, but lines up silently, in the shadows, in full awareness. Stay where you are. Listen quietly. Read between the lines. Everything is unfolding. Trust the plan. According to some economists, a banking sector collapse is expected in October, but this is a rough prediction. This is not a drill. It is not a rumor. It is the final act. According to the X22 report, we are in the midst of a controlled demolition of the central banking system. This isn't a chaotic collapse, but a strategic dismantling designed to pave the way for a more sound and equitable financial landscape. Trump says the United Nations is useless and only sends strongly worded letters without follow-up. He says he ended several wars without the UN even attempting to offer assistance. The president accused the UN of fueling the global illegal immigration crisis by funding migrants. On September 7th, President Trump signed the Quantum Restorative Health Systems Directive, a classified order that authorizes the nationwide deployment of medical beds and the implementation of a brain reset protocols. With this order, he has greenlit 3 crucial operations: the deployment of more than 100 medical care centers in the US, with more in the works for Europe and South America, the mandatory implementation of a new neuroenergy consciousness enhancement system called NISES, a brain reset program required to safely interact with the medbed's quantum interface, and the declassification of more than 60 frequency healing patterns. And that's all for today. Thanks a lot, dear friends.